Well, that's not really how you use the rule of thirds. I'll go beyond the rule of thirds and show you some more what I call compositional tools that you can add to your tool belt. The rule of thirds can be a good starting point for most photographers. However, the problem with it is that you may actually end up having your entire portfolio based on the rule of thirds, which in turn can become a little bit boring. And using the rule of thirds can actually be a habit that is very hard to get rid of. The classic and basic way of using the rule of thirds is simply just to put your subject on one of the intersection points, and whoop-de-doo, magically you now have a strong composition. The problem is that by using it like this, you may actually end up throwing your photo way out of balance. The thing about the rule of thirds is that you can most often actually overlay the grid on most photos and force through and say that the photographer has used the rule of thirds. However, that's not really how you use the rule of thirds. And the first rule or tool I want to talk about is the tool of space. It's actually a compositional tool that I see many new photographers struggle with. So let's dig into a few examples. In this first photo here, we have me standing in a waterfall, and I have actually used the tool of space right here. If you have any kind of perceivable front or back to either human, an animal, a building, car, a boat, anything where you can imagine that there is a front, that front has in most circumstances to be turned into the photo. So now I'm just going to turn myself to the side, and you can see right here I'm looking out of the photo. I'm not looking into the photo. Here I'm looking into the photo. The front of your subject have to be turned towards the middle, and that is what the tool of space says. And likewise, in this example, where I have my subject, the little person standing looking into the frame on the left side of the photo, so he's turned towards the right. This here is also a classic rule of third composition. However, if I had that person looking out of the frame, I would completely ruin the entire photo. And that is why you need to go beyond the rule of thirds. In this photo here, I have the car driving into the photo. Here I have the penguin walking up and into the photo. In this photo here, I have the whale diving down under the water, but still into the photo. The next compositional tool is repeating patterns. Generally, we human beings, we cannot not see patterns when we're out in nature. We love order, we love patterns. So benefit from that because it will raise the aesthetics of your photos. In this particular case here, I have the roof of the house mirroring the top of the mountain. In this photo, I have the lines of the hills throughout the fields, and I have the tractor tracks spaced out. So there's so many repeating patterns. Here I have lines of tulips that are also repeated throughout the scene. Here I of course have the repeating lines of the trees, but it's especially the two deer down here that are looking towards the viewer, where you also have the repeating shape of the heads and ears. In this photo, it's the repeating shape of the tree and the hot air balloon, where they both kind of looks like a drop that is turned upside down. And here we have the repeating shapes of the mountains in the background. Here we also have a couple of repeating shapes where the tree and the cloud have more or less the same shape. And here we have the repeating cypress trees along the road leading us into the farmhouse. So the next thing you can do is break those patterns, make something stand out in those patterns. We humans, we are drawn to things that stand out. We are drawn to contrasts, whether it's color, tones, shapes, and so forth. We love contrasts. In this example, we have, of course, the repeating patterns throughout the fields, and then we have that one tree that stands out. Here we have the lines, again, of the fields, and another tree that stands out relative to all the lines in the photo. Here are more lines throughout a forest, but one of those lines is crooked, and that's the one that grabs our attention. A bunch of red tulips, and then that one yellow flower standing out. And I could have put that yellow flower in either the corner of the photo, in the lower part of the photo. I could have thrown it out of focus. It doesn't matter. The yellow tulip draws all the attention because it's yellow standing out on red. The next tool is what I call chop the top, and that is all about how we perceive a landscape when we transfer it from the 3D environment we're standing in to a 2D photo. And basically it just means, as you can see in this example here, I'm standing in front of a big mountain. If I want that mountain to look even bigger, I simply just crop out the top. In this way, we do not know where the top of the mountain is. So the mountain wall there in the background looks much larger, even though I have actually zoomed in and I am actually bigger in the photo than in the previous photo. But simply just by cropping it out, the background looks much larger. And in this example from before, I'm cropping the top of the frame just where you start to be able to see the sky. And in that way, it looks much bigger and much more impactful. In this photo, I've made sure not to include the horizon line in top of the frame, and in that way it looks like the ocean just continues forever. Also, the horizon line will not distract the viewer. And it's technically not just the top of the photo, it's also the sides of the photo. So in this example here from a waterfall in Iceland, I've purposely cropped out the right side of the waterfall. So in that way, it actually looks as if the waterfall won't stop just a little bit outside the frame, but it will continue and give the perception that the waterfall is much larger than it actually is. It is still a large waterfall though. Now the next tool here is a little bit harder to wrap your head around, but I call it meaningful depth. What I mean by meaningful depth is simply just that I see a lot of photos, whether it's wide angle or telephoto and so forth, try to force in a foreground that doesn't add anything besides depth. Depth is in and of itself actually a pretty good tool to use to create a sense of 3D in your photos. However, sometimes the foreground is just boring or doesn't work. So in this example here, the foreground is just one big mess. If I wanted to show a messy photo, then I've succeeded, but that was not the purpose of the photo. In this case here, I have all the green grass, all the lines there, and a little bit of a reflection. It makes for a much cleaner foreground than the previous one. And in that way, the photo is much more compelling to look at. And you don't need to have a dramatic foreground. It can simply just be some foreground trees. Purposely did not include some immediate foreground from the grasses in front because I don't think they added to the photo. However, the foreground trees very much added to the photo to create the depth throughout the scene and of course frame my subject, the tree that is split there in the middle of the frame. In this photo from the highlands of Iceland, I've placed myself in the foreground looking into the scene. It gives a sense of adventure and of course also a little bit of scale. If I had not been standing there, this photo wouldn't have been half as interesting. In this photo, I really wanted to photograph how the shadows were thrown down through the two trees there in the background. And I knew I needed some kind of foreground, not just to have the lake there. So I was waiting for some kind of bird to swim into the photo, and luckily this pack of birds flew in front of it instead, and I captured this one, which has become one of my all-time favorite photos and really shows that morning atmosphere with birds flying around on top of the lakes here in Denmark. The next compositional tool that you can use is called juxtaposition. However, it can be a little bit hard to find in nature. Juxtaposition simply just means that you have contrasting elements or opposite elements in a photo. So here we have this super modern ship, and in the foreground we have this old destroyed weather station. So we have the juxtaposition between the old and the new. The same boat, here we have the juxtaposition between nature down in the corner and the big human-made object. So nature versus human. Another example of nature versus human, a car driving around in the highlands of Iceland.
And this is the real aha moment for me. This is really what changed the way that I look at composition while I'm on location. Now, it comes as no surprise that composition is one of the more difficult, if not the most difficult aspect of landscape photography. I haven't heard this particular technique mentioned too often, as it's not one of the, I guess, the more mainstream approaches to tackling composition, like the more popular techniques, such as the use of leading lines and maybe foreground interest and layers to create depth. This technique was really the proverbial aha moment for me that really changed how I now look at creating compelling compositions while on location. And perhaps the best part of this entire technique, other than its effectiveness, of course, is how easy and natural it is to apply to whatever situation you happen to find yourself in. Now, this isn't a multi-step process or anything that's really difficult to remember, only two super simple steps, but I think it'll change your mindset the next time you're on location, just as it did mine. And I know you already know this and you've heard other people mention this as well, but when you get on location, definitely don't pull out your camera, don't pull out your tripod and start setting up a composition. Definitely take a minute, catch your breath from perhaps the hike that it took to get to that particular location, and just sit down, get some water, relax for a minute, and just kind of survey the scene. And you're probably already doing this anyway. It's just this kind of a different way to position it. But when you get to your scene and you're relaxing, you're surveying, you're just checking everything out, start taking a mental inventory and ask yourself, what do you love about this scene? What do you like about it? Why do you want to point your camera at this particular scene that's unfolding right in front of your very eyes? And start to take this inventory and ask yourself, what do you like most about what you see? It could be the waterfall that you're standing in front of. Maybe it's the autumn leaves that are surrounding this waterfall, or maybe it's the outflow of this waterfall, or maybe there's some interesting rocks in the foreground that got some nice green algae or something growing on it. There's the things that really catch your eye. And what's so cool about this process is if you could take two people, put them in front of the same scene, and their list of things that they love about the scene, there's a very good chance that it could be different. So it's a very personal exercise. And so, for example, right here, this particular scene here, I absolutely love it. And some of the things that I really liked about the scene, of course, I love the salt columns here. I love the color in the sky. I love this interesting sea stack here. And of course, the gentleman right here photographing the scene unfolding, I think adds a lot of story. So those are the things that I love about this particular scene. This example here, a much more minimalistic scene. I love the contrast between this type of an iceberg versus this. This one's very blue, this one's very white, this one's very tall, this one's very flat. I like those two elements of this composition. I love the water right through here, and I love the background of the mountains that are snow-capped in the background of these icebergs. So those are the things that I like about this particular scene. So when you go through this inventory exercise, just start to take a mental note. Ideally, you'll have between maybe 2 or 4 or 5 things that you love about a particular composition. Now, I should say a particular scene. Now, the second step of this process, and this is the real aha moment for me, this is really what changed the way that I look at composition while I'm on location. It kind of made things seem a lot more, I guess I should say, less mentally straining. This process here really simplifies it, really streamlines it. So you basically take the things that you love in step 1, and those are the pieces of your puzzle. So step 2 is you just put the pieces of your puzzle together. So you take the things that you loved about that scene and start organizing it in different ways, I should say. So going back to this image right here, I love the man standing here, the photographer, the salt columns, the color in the sky, and the sea stack in the background. And those are the things that I wanted to figure out a way to arrange in this particular scene. Now, obviously, I can't move that sea stack. I can't change where the color in the sky is happening, and I can't move those salt columns. But most of the time, you're not going to be able to move the things in your scene. But that's the beauty of this camera right here. Your camera has the ability to change the way things look in your photograph, to change the way things are positioned in your scene. If you get really low to the ground, things are going to appear up in the upper portion of your overall composition. If you move to the left or you move to the right, or maybe you angle your camera down or angle it up, this is going to change the positioning where things are in your overall photograph. So when I first took this scene, I was actually shooting straight on, more towards just getting the photographer, the salt columns, and the color in the sky. But I wanted to make sure that I got that C stack, because this C stack here balances out this overall scene. So I ended up shifting all the way to the left to where the photographer was more on the left side of the screen, and the salt columns were there with a little bit of green patch on top of the salt columns. And I was still able to get the C stack in the right side here and still get all the color in the sky. So even though I couldn't move that C stack, I shifted over more so I could capture all 4 of the things that I loved about this photograph. In this example here, I really love the way that the top of this iceberg here kind of fit perfectly in this little crevice of where these snow-capped mountains are in the background. And I wanted to make sure that I could try and get that in there because I felt that that created a little bit of separation. If I swung all the way to the right, the mountain that would be behind that iceberg wasn't snow-capped, so it didn't look quite as interesting. Plus, this area right here started to converge, and I didn't get that separation between the two. And this is kind of where that process of identifying what you love about a scene comes in handy, because you know what's important to you. You know what you want to be able to see in that photograph. And when I'm going through this kind of piecing the puzzle portion of this process, I'm not using a tripod. I'm literally just kind of walking around and just pointing the camera and moving it in different directions, up, down, left, right, swinging to the left, swinging to the right, getting really low. And then when you get to a position to where things are starting to make sense, your puzzle's starting to come together, that's when you pull out the tripod, put the camera on the tripod, to where you can start to make those kind of more minute changes to the overall scene to really kind of dial it in. And here's another good example from, once again, from Iceland. I love the this tree right here. I loved how this tree right here kind of used natural framing to frame in this church in the background. And I love the all the different gradients of the shadows and highlights all through here. And I love this mushroom right here because it kind of anchored the whole foreground. And these are the things that I really loved about the scene. So when I started to compose it, I just walked all around it, just trying to figure out exactly what's the most pleasing way to get everything in the scene that I love about this photograph. And this is the final composition that I settled on. I just love the natural framing of these trees and how it kind of hugs the church in the background. And I love how the mushroom right here just kind of draws your eye to that foreground. And you kind of walk your eye through the highlights and the shadows. A little bit of dodging and burning in here went a long way, all the way into the church in the center of the photograph. And in this image, I know I shared this last week. Of course, I love the mountains in the background. I love the rushing water. I love any kind of water that's falling. That's my my kind of go-to thing. That's what I get most excited about. And I loved how the foreground here kind of just mimicked this. It just kind of got this sweeping nature all the way up until the mountain in the background. And I wanted to make sure I captured a lot of this area here just to exaggerate that kind of S curve, that winding look of that foreground and how it leads to the waterfall and to ultimately to the mountain in the background. And those are the things that I love the most about this scene. And that's what I wanted to include in my composition. So asking yourself when you get on location, what do I love about this scene? Why do I want to point my camera at it? Why do I want to take this photograph? And take that inventory and then piece the puzzle, or I should say create the puzzle based off of the pieces that you created in the very first step when you're taking that survey. And that completely changed the way that I look at composition while I'm on location. It simplified it, and it just made it to be not so mentally straining on myself when I got on location. It was a very relaxed mindset or thought track. And it really, I think it improved my composition, and I definitely enjoyed it a little bit better just to think about it. You're just putting the pieces of a puzzle together and identifying what those pieces are. So I really hope that this information in this video will definitely maybe create that aha moment for you. I know that that was kind of this is one of those kind of moments that just completely changed the way that I look at composition while I'm on location.
I'm going to talk about what I think is the most powerful compositional tool that a photographer has. There's one tool, one element of composition that I think is more powerful than any other, and that is the diagonal. And it seems like such a random thing. You think, what, a diagonal? How can that help my photos? And what makes a photo good? What are the ingredients for photo that makes it really good? And I think there's two things. It transports the image to the location. It creates a bit of a mood, you know, it evokes some mood in that viewer, whether they think wow, or whether they think, oh, that looks a bit sad, or whatever. But a landscape photo can do that, and that's really important. Another part of that, though, is to keep the viewer's attention. And to keep the viewer's attention, diagonals are really important. Now, I'm not saying that every photo that you ever take is going to take diagonals. Here's a few examples of photos of mine that don't have any diagonals in, but I love them. But I do think that a diagonal is a great tool, especially if you're just getting started or you're stuck at a certain level with your photography and want to just elevate it a little bit. So a diagonal is powerful because if you think about a building, if as soon as it goes like that, it looks like it's going to fall over. So a diagonal creates a sense of movement in a photo. The other things you can think about are perspective. You can think about your eye wanting to travel down a diagonal, whether it doesn't so much want to travel down something that's horizontal because that seems more stable within an image. Let's just talk about the first thing, and that's depth. So if we take this image here, so this is an image by my friend Peter Iversen, and you can see that it's got two strong diagonals in it to the horizon here. And you know that this image has got depth because you know that that pier is the same width all the way, but it's getting thinner, and that's created by these perspective lines of diagonals. And diagonals have got a really good role to play in lots of things, but one of them is creating depth in your image. So a diagonal is a great way of creating a three-dimensional image. The next thing to think about is leading lines. They're the obvious ones for diagonals, and you can get a shot like this with this incredible road leading into the image. It works really well if you have that road at a diagonal, because your eye just wants to follow it. Already your eye wants to follow a road, but if you create a diagonal as well, you want to follow it. And this image here has got a number of diagonals that really, really help. So we've got this leading line here that takes you all the way up and actually goes back in that direction. But we've also got another parallel line here and another opposing line here. So these lines and this line are all meeting here. So your eye is just going all the way there. And that's created by diagonals. So this is another good example of a leading line being a diagonal into an image. And again, this has got multiple diagonals in it. There's this diagonal here, but there's also diagonals coming from this corner as well, which are opposing that diagonal, which is sort of leading your eye into the image. If I show you a version of this where I was actually waiting for the wave just to create this diagonal with my wide angle lens, it was just pointed down a little bit. And a wide angle lens with waves is a great way of creating diagonals, because you create a bit of perspective distortion, which just creates that diagonal automatically. But if you look at this shot here, I know the light's a little bit different, but this isn't much of a diagonal. It's almost a straight line. And if it was straight, it just looked really awkward. It just wouldn't be pleasing to the eye. This one just draws your eye in with this diagonal. This one, this straight line's not as pleasing. I'm not saying that this wouldn't work, but at the moment it's neither a straight line or a diagonal. So it just looks a bit confusing, really. This is another great example of a leading line being a diagonal. It's almost an S-curve, this is. But what makes this as well is these other diagonals as well that are, like I said in the previous image, that are bringing your eye into the image. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is placement of diagonals. It's really important to think about where you place your diagonals. Now, you might have them coming from the corner, like the images that I just showed you there, and that's great, you can do that. But you can also place your diagonals in a way to lead the viewer through an image. So in this image here, I've talked about this so many times before, this image, but it's a really good example. We've got this hut down here, and I placed these two diagonals. I say I placed these two diagonals. I didn't go and put the mountains there, did I? But the image works. And I did think that when I took the image, because of these diagonals, and there's one there, and there's one there, and they are drawing your eye to this house here. And they are so powerful in this image. They're helped by the light as well. But those diagonals leading you to this house makes such a big difference to this image. There's actually one other diagonal in this image that really helps, and I talk about it a lot, opposing diagonals. And there's an opposing diagonal here. And that opposing diagonal is almost one that's there. If you get diagonals that are almost like 90 degrees to the main diagonals in your image, and you can have smaller diagonals, then that just adds joining elements to your image. It sort of connects the image together and makes the image more pleasing. You want to look at the image for longer. You see more things within the image. So just thinking about that when you're composing is really, really important. So thinking about where you're putting your diagonal, I did say you can go from the corner. I don't always like to go from the corner in my diagonals. So if I've got a leading line like this, sometimes you can just go a little bit outside the corner. I think that's quite nice to do that. I think this works quite well in this case. But you can also place your diagonals so they match other diagonals within the image. So if we have a look at this one here, this is a diagonal here where I was stood. I couldn't change that diagonal a huge amount, but I could move left and right and move the positioning of this diagonal. And what I wanted to do is just make sure that they were parallel. And then I create a very strong diagonal by connecting those two together that then leads to that background mountain. And if I'd have just taken this shot a little bit further up or a little bit further to the left, or if I'd taken it much further to the left, it would have probably dropped off. But having those parallel diagonals and thinking about, is there a diagonal in the scene? And is there a way I can move to connect another diagonal to that diagonal? Parallels are good, and 90-degree diagonals are good in the scene. You want to try and get the viewer to spend more time looking at your image. But this is a little bit more of a subtle diagonal. You can see if I just go and draw on this, we've got some diagonals coming down here, which I call the secondary diagonals. And then we've got a primary diagonal coming through here. And then we've got another secondary diagonal there. And basically what your eye does is it sees this, which is very strong. It goes up here, and then it sees these here, and then it can jump and see this one here. So by connecting those diagonals in the scene makes such a big difference to the viewer's appreciation of your photo. So the next thing, which is dynamism and energy and movement. A diagonal creates energy and movement in an image. It helps your eye move. By placing a diagonal in an image of very straight lines like this one, you can create something that has got more, it just looks more alive, I suppose. It also can create something that's very dramatic. So having that diagonal across these very straight trees in the background creates something that's just a little bit different. It's a little bit more dynamic. But I use diagonals all the time in waterfalls, just by going and standing to the side, which is such a powerful tool in photography. Just take your tripod. In fact, don't even put your camera on a tripod to begin with. Just move from left to right, get your position right. You can create that diagonal, and that adds to, in this case, the flow of this water. So the water is, you automatically think this water's flowing, but you've also got, in this case, this diagonal that's adding to it and creating this more dynamic scene. Again, in this shot here, what works really well with this iceberg and this water is the fact that I've got all these diagonals pointing at this iceberg. And because you've got these diagonals in there, you get that appreciation of the water flowing more. Whereas if you look in the background where the waves are, the water in those waves in the background is still moving, but because it's very horizontal, those lines, it doesn't feel like it's moving so much, whereas here it's very, very dynamic. So you can use them so strongly. But the best example of the opposing diagonal is the S-curve. This is not a particularly brilliant shot of mine. To be honest, I struggle to find many shots that I've taken with the S-curve. But if you look at this, then we've got a diagonal like that, a diagonal like that, a diagonal like that, and a diagonal like that. And that's what the S-curve is, really. If you think about an S, then it's just a bunch of diagonals in an image. And that's why an S-curve works, because you go down one, then you turn the other direction, you go down the other, then you turn the other direction, you go down the other. This is the first one. This is from Steve Marson. And this is a bit of a subtle S-curve. You can see that there's a diagonal there, a diagonal there, a diagonal there, and that's taking you and leading you down through that S-curve. There's some more diagonals here as well, so you end up here and then you jump to C-stacks in the background. So this is a good example of an S-curve, because you can have subtle S-curves like this one here from Stephen Rhodes. This is a really good example of the subtlety in nature. So this is just a little brook, but you can see it's just, you almost perceive this line going around because of the greener grass, and we've got this nice S-curve leading up to the mountain. And then this one here from Alan Yim. So this is a beautiful shot. I really, really like this. And the S-curve's a little bit hidden, but again, we've got this really nice inverse S-curve leading you up. And it's those connection of diagonals which make this such a pleasing image. And it is why the S-curve is so nice. But the opposing diagonal doesn't have to be in an S-curve. This is a good, strong example of a great opposing diagonal. So we've got a diagonal here, and then we've got another diagonal here. And then we've actually got a diagonal here as well. And this just is so strong. I can't say just how strong it is when you have these opposing diagonals. So this is another really strong example. So this has got a lot of symmetry in it. Again, one of the things that I thought is taking the people as they walked across this ridge in the Faroe Islands, which is I've got this diagonal going through here, but I've got this diagonal here and this diagonal here. And so this is a very symmetrical image. If you draw a line down the middle here, then we've got, a very symmetrical set of diagonals, and that symmetry really helps this image. It makes it such a powerful image. So thinking about those opposing diagonals, see if you can get symmetry in them. Parallel diagonals as well are really, really good. There's perceived diagonals, which are where you start to get very strong images. But this image here is one that I'm really proud of, because this is something that I really thought about creating a perceived diagonal in it. So I found this big rock here, and I position myself in a way that this rock goes through a line here. You can see that this rock connects, and there's a line through there, and then there's another line here as well. So we've got two lines in this image that are leading your eye up to the C-stack and this wave in the background. And that is so powerful. It's so powerful if you can have perceived diagonals. So diagonals that you don't automatically see, but are very subtle in an image. People just look at an image and think, I love that, but they might not automatically see why they love it. And that's when you start to get things that are really special. So again, it's a cross between a perceived diagonal and a real diagonal. I mean, we've got this here, but there's another diagonal coming down from this branch up here, and this is leading into the hut. And then this one is a really good example of connecting elements to create diagonals and create perceived diagonals. So triangles are obviously a set of diagonals, but we've got a diagonal there, and we have a connection there. But these two diagonals here connect these elements together in a triangle, and a triangle is another strong shape within an image. So anything you can do to connect things together in a diagonal pattern in your image will definitely help it. I just want to show you a couple more examples of that. So this is a perceived diagonal in two of my favorite trees that are hugging. So we've got this diagonal here, this strong diagonal through the branch, and then another one here that are connecting where I perceive the tree's heads to be. They're embracing together. But it's those diagonals that help. And then again, these diagonals here, there is some strong diagonals here, and then there is a perceived diagonal in this shot here of enchanted. There's a diagonal here, there's a diagonal here through these rocks. This one, and that really helps because these two parallel diagonals create quite a strong compositional element which help to balance this very strong diagonal on the right hand side. And there's a balance across the middle then of these two visual weights. So by connecting these two together through parallel diagonals has really, really helped. And then we've got the opposing diagonals as well.
Secondly, the time to break this rule and place your subject in the middle is when you have symmetry. Common mistake people make is having people, pets, or wildlife in their photos but not leaving room to look into. If you squash your subject against a side of your photo with no room, it's like punishing someone by making them stand in a corner. Also, the rest of the photo just seems to be out there getting ignored. When you have something with vision in your photo, you should give them room to look into. Get that edge away from their face, and if you can align it, find something interesting or colorful or with patterns to fill that empty space. Empty space is okay too, but something that's complementary is a great addition. Mistake number 2 is to put your subject in the middle of your frame, but without any symmetry. The middle is rarely the most interesting place to put your subject. Try putting them on one side, maybe juxtaposed or balanced by something else. Use the rule of thirds to place the areas of interest off to one side, for example. Secondly, the time to break this rule and place your subject in the middle is when you have symmetry. When having equal weight on both sides, the middle has a unique way of providing a balance. When a subject is looking directly at you, for example, is a great time to try placing them in the middle. These examples work best in the middle because they provide a balanced and equally proportional view. Or this surfer photo of mine, where the water spray here and the beautiful sky here provide a nice balance of interest to support the subject. A derivative of placing your subject too close to the edge is losing your main elements out of the frame. This comes from not being able to fit your subject or important element in the shot and just including part of it and cutting off the rest. Unless you've really done this well, this doesn't usually work, unless it's a compelling leading line or a feature that one expects to go forever, like a long, lonely road. But for this log that wouldn't fit in my waterfall shot, it just looks bad. Get something you can fit all in, like this rock instead. Mistake number 4 is having too many subjects or none at all. By too many subjects, I mean a photo where nothing is obviously the main feature. And if you ask 4 people what the subject is, you could get 4 different answers. In this photo, what's the subject? The lighthouse? The sun popping out from the clouds? The reflecting water? Or this reflection on the rocks? Too many subjects in this one means that it isn't clear where the viewer should look. But in this photo here, I have made it clear where your eye should be drawn. Or in this photo of big waves, none of them are standing out as the main feature. But in this shot here, we know who the main actor is. Or in this photo, make it simple. Sometimes less is more. The other end of the spectrum is no subject. This is a common mistake with beginner landscape photographers, where they want to photograph a beautiful view out into the vast ocean. Instead, you get half sky, half water, and a line between them, but no compelling feature or highlight. This photo has no subject. Instead, find something you can put in the foreground, a rock, a pattern in the sand, roots of a tree, or anything else that can anchor the photo with that beautiful view being in the background. Or add some flowers to a sunset, like in this photo. The next mistake I often see is the opposite of placing your subject in the middle. It is having your subjects too close to the edges, making them feel crowded. Now this is a careful balance, as one technique of composition is to leave some empty space. This is often done by placing your subject close to one side. The problem is this is a fine art. It can look good like this or like this, but if you slide too close to the edge, all of a sudden it just doesn't work anymore. Go towards the edge and then come back a bit. Including something interesting in the negative space works well too, like this pink sky in this photo. The next common mistake is very prevalent, including in wildlife photography: the wrong perspective or angle. This means that the subject and its alignment isn't maximized with the rest of the scene. For example, here's a photo of a bird that I took while standing. Then all I did was get down lower and took the same photo with the exact same settings. Look at how that transformed the photo by getting it eye level and making the background and foreground out of focus. So this can be not shooting up or shooting down, rather getting to eye level, or not getting up or down when that's what will accentuate the subject. Shooting at your standing eye level, the same place from which anyone else would see the scene, is rarely the place that'll make the most compelling image. The trick is to move around. Get your subject framed with other elements in the scene, like this photo I took just a few days ago. The trick here is when you've identified a subject, look around for angles, elements, or lines that can add to your photo. The next mistake I see is people not putting enough effort into getting the right background. One of the most important tips I tell people is the background is part of the photo too. This mistake, which I've made before, don't worry, is part of a laziness problem. We're just too lazy to move 5 feet to the right or 5 feet to the left to get an annoying or distracting element out from our background. Remember, if it's not adding to your photo, it's probably taking away from it. Like these people behind my lion shot. Waiting a bit for them to move or repositioning for the shot would greatly improve it. If they're not part of your plan, get those stop signs, trash cans, and buildings out of your photos. And that's the problem of shooting too tight, filling the frame with your subject and not including other elements that tell a story about the subject. Where was it? When? What else was happening? These are all important clues to either support your subject or allow your viewer to start speculating and making up their own ideas about what this photo is all about. Find ways to give your subject some room and fill that room with other things that complement but not overpower your subject. Lines, textures, or colors are great examples. So not this, but this. There's nothing wrong with having your subject small in the frame.
Point your camera at the cool and then eliminate everything that isn't cool. I want to talk about composition in a new way. I want to get to the root of what is composition when it comes to photography, how we can make our compositions better immediately. What is composition? Well, if you think about other types of composition, musical composition, we start with nothing and add things. With the landscape, and this is one of the arguments about composition or why landscape photography isn't art. The argument is that everything that there is in a composition is already out there and we just have to point our camera at it. And what I want to demonstrate is that, yes, there are things out there, but they don't instantly lend themselves to be compositions. This is the little fairy tree on Vancouver Island, and for such a famous little tree, it can be surprisingly difficult to actually compose something that kind of captures the spirit of it and shows it to its best. There's a lot of foreground bushes in the way. There's not many different places that you can stand to get a good view. And as you can see in this scene here, this is the fairy tree here, and it's in the middle of a lake. And obviously when it's calm like this, we get some nice reflections. So the elements that are present at the time that we are there are obviously going to contribute to the type of photographs that we can make. Now, if I do go to the cropped version of this, so basically if I go down to now as shot, you can see that I was cutting slices of the landscape, which is something I do. But if we go back to the original here, where I found my brain engaging with this scene was understanding that the fairy tree is the subject. You know, that is the thing that is the obvious thing in the frame to photograph, I think. And if you go to famous locations to photograph an icon, then you're going to photograph the icon. We can see here that it's in shade and that the background is brighter than the foreground. So what we have is all of these reflected trees are brighter and actually quite dynamic, and all of these areas are brighter than the actual subject itself or the thing that we want to highlight. All of this stuff in the foreground, all these brighter areas. how do you photograph scenes? You know, how do you find your compositions? The spontaneously came up with a little expression, which is point your camera at the cool and then eliminate everything that isn't cool. One of the things with this scene is that your place in space is really, really important. You're limited in terms of access views because of brush that's grown up and so forth. So you are somewhat limited with where you can stand and where you can isolate this tree from. From this side, we are isolating the tree against a more even background. However, in this scene here, you can see here the reflection becomes part of, or becomes silhouetted against the sky. Let's look at some various ways that we can eliminate the uncool in this scene to keep the cool. The first option is to look at something like a square and just pull this down and end up with something in this type of area. And what this does quite successfully is isolate the tree and create a more simple composition. We've eliminated a whole bunch of stuff, and the more stuff that we eliminate, the easier it is for the point of the photograph to become clear. And I think that's really what composition is to me, is we're making a point. We're saying, this is cool, and I've eliminated all the uncool stuff, and all I'm leaving you with is the cool stuff here. So we might need to fine tune this composition a little bit more. Turn the lights out. We now have a rendition of this scene that's much more concise. We've certainly got rid of a lot of the uncool. If I make a virtual copy and just reset the scene, so we're back now to our full frame. Aspect ratio is incredibly important. That square is very concise, but the bottom of the scene, the way the silhouette interacts with that luminosity there, it doesn't feel very balanced to me. So another way to look at this is to go to the how I shot it. Right, so that is closer to the scene that I took in camera. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fine tune that. So this 65 by 24 aspect ratio that I use quite regularly now, what this has enabled me to do is to isolate the tree away from the reflection. And what we've taken away is a large chunk of luminosity, that big bright section at the bottom of the frame. And what that's done is it's allowed the tree and the luminosity at the top of the little hemlock, this little tree here, it allows that to be more evident. So if I darken this image, we can see that the luminosity, pull that right down until it gets quite bare. And then I'm going to increase the whites and the highlights in there, and maybe just a touch more luminosity on that side. And what that's done is changed the balance between the luminosity on the left-hand side of the frame and the right-hand side. The reflections are now darker than the subject. So what we've managed to do now is isolate something in a slightly more abstract form. Sure, we've taken it out of its context, we've cropped away the uncool, and the aspect ratio, that big expansive panoramic aspect ratio, that has allowed a feeling of expansiveness. It just feels like a much more grand scene, a much bigger scene. And this is why panos are such powerful tools when it comes to emphasizing space and openness. By removing the uncool from this scene and allowing the more important content, the cool of the composition, to sit in the frame in a much more powerful manner. By removing all those distractions, it becomes very clear what this photograph is about, this little tree growing out of the cut-off old growth tree. Removing the cool is the best way of making your compositions more concise. We can look at any scene and probably find a more rational or condensed version of it. Where you live in space, so just moving a few meters left or right, or even a few millimeters left or right, or up or down, is going to change your perspectives and how the content interacts with all of the stuff around it. Compositions do not exist in nature. The world is not just there waiting for you to point your camera at already perfectly composed scenes. That is not how the world works. Our position in space, given any particular moment in time, is really, really important. And that's what makes landscape photography such a powerful tool for our personal expression. There was 9 people on this workshop, plus Adam and myself. There was 11 people photographing that little tree on that particular morning. And we all came away with different photographs, different perspectives, different ways of expressing ourselves.
So when you don't have light, the next best thing to look for is a lovely S-curve. So I walked past the composition that I shot previously and instantly found this lovely, wonderful S-curve leading out into the sea. And I just thought, I have to shoot this. So I always say that light is one of the most important elements in landscape photography. But you don't always have light. So when you don't have light, the next best thing to look for is a lovely S-curve, and that's what I've got here. It's just gorgeous. I mean, I walked onto this beach, and as soon as I saw it, I thought, bang, that's image number 1. It's looking out to the lovely, calm sea. I'm not using a polarizer because I want the image to be full of contrast, and I want the S-shaped river to really, really pop. And to do that, I leave polarizing filter off, because if you have a polarizing filter on your lens, it cuts out glare from the surface of the water. Now, the glare on the surface of this water is what gives it contrast. The water is reflecting the bright sky. You need that reflection in order to give it contrast. So although there are a lot of low cloud, there is a little bit of color coming through. And actually the low cloud, which can often be the enemy, it can also sometimes be your friend. You've got these lovely low clouds going across the sky with a touch of colour behind the sky. The wonderful, wonderful S-shaped leading line of this river. The lovely, empty, calm beach in the background. It's calm, it's soothing, it's everything I love about landscape photography. I talk a lot about the images being secondary to experience, so coming out and just taking a moment. Be mindful of your surroundings, enjoy the peace and quiet. Just try and take it all in and try and enjoy being in the moment rather than stressing about getting an image. I'm waffling on, I'm gonna have to take this image. Right, what have we got here? F8, 3.2 seconds. I have a 4-stop filter on because I just want to slow down the exposure, because we've got a bit of movement in this river with the ripples of the sand. I also have a 2-stop hard edge grad filter because obviously the sky's bright now. It's coming up to sunrise and the sky's always bright. I'm at about 60 mil, something like that, and I have my camera set to a 2-second timer. I'm going to get this image now. Oh, there's some lovely, lovely colour in the sky. Absolutely stunning. So I'm just heading down to the water's edge now to see if I can get another shot. I fancy a nice long exposure. We've got excellent movement in the water, an amazing movement in the sky. It's just a really nice morning. You're never done with a location. You should always return to the same locations time and time again, because I know I'm guilty of this in the past, and others are guilty of this, where you shoot a location once or twice. People don't know which way to go. So as I'm walking back along the beach, I just clocked this composition. Lovely shapes in the sand, kind of horizontal shapes crisscrossing back and forward. And I just thought it was a really nice abstract image. We have a very monochrome scene. There's no colour here. It's almost silver. So while setting up to take this photograph, I placed a CD under each foot of my tripod. And the reason I do this is this sand is incredibly waterlogged. As soon as you put the tripod on, it sinks. But it can be quite deceiving because it slowly sinks, so you don't notice it. So if you have an exposure of like a second or half a second or anything like that, then you're going to get motion blur, but you won't realise it until you get back to the computer. And that's because your tripod's probably sinking in the sand. So by placing the discs under the feet, it gives it a wider surface area and stops it sinking. Now I'm going to capture this photograph here. This is on F10, about 1/3 of a second. Not much polarization, so the contrast of the water, and it's just, I'll say the contrast of the reflection on the water, should I say. And it's just I don't know, this image might work, it might not, but it was enough for me to stop and set up and capture the image. All in all, I'd say it was definitely worthwhile. and because it's now starting to rain, which is definitely my cue to go home. Post-production techniques like dodging and burning can be used to manipulate and shape that light to enhance the composition. Perseverance and dedication are words that come to mind when I think of photography. But when you strip everything back, we're all working with the same fundamental tool, the environment. Highlands of Scotland. What an absolutely beautiful place this is. Now we're here to capture sunrise this morning, but I also wanted to talk about 5 compositional techniques that I consider on pretty much every landscape photograph that I take. So I think composing a photograph is like playing a bit of a game, isn't it? It's a bit of a puzzle, if you will. Now, I think there's various problems that we've always got to solve in every photo. So where do we actually start when we're faced with something beautiful like we've got here? Well, I guess everybody has got their own thought process, and I'm not saying mine is the only way or the right way, but I've got 5 considerations that I always run through on every photograph. So my first consideration is one that I think often gets overlooked, but it's crucial in my opinion. Now, when I arrive at a scene I believe is worthy of a photograph like this one, I simply just take a moment. I leave the camera in the bag, I observe the scene, breathe in the air, soak in the atmosphere, and just enjoy the moment for a couple of minutes. Quite often a photo will present itself to me rather than me having to hunt around for it. I tend to ask myself a few questions during this time as well, like how does the place make me feel? Is there a story within the landscape? Is there a mood present? These feelings can sometimes influence how I compose a scene and can be essential to driving a narrative within the frame. Now, of course, we don't always have time for this, do we? Especially when there's, say, an amazing rainbow or the sun's just like lighting the landscape up. So I think we need to remain reactive. However, if we can just take a few minutes, I think it really helps. So I've got my composition framed up here for my sunrise photograph. It's about on sunrise right now. We're getting a bit of detail in the sky, which is really nice. Now, I've been really careful here because the loch is so calm. I'm really going for the reflection of the mountain, and I've tried to be very, very mindful of where that reflection sits in the scene, because we've got this little break between these 2 little islands here. I'm trying to position the reflection right in the middle of that. So obviously the height of our camera means the reflection either gets larger or smaller within the frame. So I've just been very mindful about the height of my position and also where I am left and right as well. Very subtle movements make a big difference to this shot. I've just really got a little bit of a gap around the reflection around these islands, which I think works well. There's a bit of snow on top of the mountain as well, and we've got a grouping of Scots pines on the left hand side, and we're really looking straight down the valley here. And I think the leading line of the reflection as well drives the eye down towards the dip in the valley there, where the scene is a little bit brighter. It's just a case of waiting now. So tip number 2 is to identify a subject. From my perspective, most of my photos I take have a clear subject and everything else kind of supports that subject, if you like. So supporting the subject can take on sort of various forms. It could be a single subject to breathe, or it might involve, say, a path or a road leading to the main point of interest. I think there are numerous ways in which another element within a photo can support the main subject. However, if we can identify one key element within our frame that truly stands out, we've got a starting point around which we can build the rest of the image. I think without identifying this key element, I found it really challenging to start unpacking the rest of the scene. Finding that subject is key, and today we've got that big mountain which is our key subject. So composition technique number 3 I consider on every photo is depth, and I consistently consider depth in each photo I take, because without it the image may lack the 3-dimensional feel that I seek in my compositions. I think introducing depth to an image is not straightforward though, but it serves as an effective way to give a 2-dimensional photo a more 3-dimensional quality. Now, there are numerous methods that can be employed to convey depth in a photo, and one standout approach for me is through atmosphere. And I think it's a factor that we've got significant control over. Now, I mention this because we can not only look for atmosphere within the landscape, but also add it in post-production too. So fog and mist, for example, are excellent for introducing separation and depth.
As we peer further into the scene, details soften, and our brains instinctively perceive those softer elements to be farther away. And this same technique can be applied to a wide shot or a vista. If we consider that the objects closer to the camera will likely have more contrast than those farther away, a touch of haze or softening in the background, softening those background details in post-production, will lead our brains to register that those softer details are actually further away. And it can be a really remarkably powerful tool to add depth and a three-dimensional feel to your photographs. Contrast in the foreground, and let that contrast fall away as we recede into the image. Now I'm going a bit more intimate with this scene here, picking out some nice details. Got some amazing light hitting the side of the mountain, and it's quite diffused. There's a bit of cloud out that way as well, so it's not too harsh just yet, but I'm making the most of it while I can, just picking out different detailed shots, trying to incorporate some reed beds, then going a bit tighter in, and just playing around with different compositions pretty much from the same spot. Let's move on to tip number 4, which I refer to as dark to light, and it involves understanding the visual impact of the brightness within the photo. So typically the eye is drawn to the brightest part of an image. Therefore, strategically positioning this bright area within the frame can effectively guide the viewer's attention to what's most important in the photo. For instance, if the brightest part is in the foreground, the viewer might miss exploring the top part of the frame, which could be suboptimal if the main element of the shot is situated up there. So consider a horizontal image framed using the rule of thirds. Ideally, I aim for the brightest part of the photo to align with one of those intersecting lines, which offers balance and harmony in the composition. Now, if this doesn't happen naturally, post-production techniques like dodging and burning can be used to manipulate and shape that light to enhance the composition, because we don't always get light exactly where we want it to be when we're out in the field. But just using those little dodging and burning techniques can really help guide the viewer into the image to where we want them to look. Tip number 5 involves eliminating distractions from the scene and being mindful of elements that may obstruct or, say, hinder the flow and separation within the image. So once I've identified the main subject, I always consider what can be removed from the composition. Are there any, distracting elements that we could do without? Now, while tools like the spot removal tool in post-production can really help, I strive to try to handle these issues in the field wherever possible. So if there's something distracting, I explore whether I can eliminate it by positioning the camera maybe higher, lower, or changing the focal length, or sometimes both. I always pay special attention to the edges of the frame, because elements lingering on the periphery, neither fully in nor out of the shot, can be surprisingly distracting. So addressing these considerations during the initial capture ensures a cleaner and more focused composition, and actually saves quite a bit of time in post-production too.